on. Okay. I think we were on the other slide. Okay, so yeah, we were talking about ethnocentrism and cultural diversity. So anyways, it's if you have a culturally diverse mindset, you're able to accept other people's cultures and benefit from them and be enriched by them. A question I have on here, does that mean that a person can justify any type of behavior in the name of culture? Like if you have this open mind, does that mean that anything goes, basically? Woodstock in the I think it was 70s or 60s, I don't know. Was that massive love fest and drug fest acceptable? Again, polygamy, back to that, the Holocaust. I mean, the German Nazis at that time justified what they were doing in the name of culture because they believed in the Aryan race and they wanted to eliminate Jewish people and other sorts of people too. So you can kind of get into a dangerous area with that. That leads me to this term that you might hear in anthropology called cultural relativism. And that's just the belief that no single culture holds claim to the absolute truth. And that sounds good and reasonable because you're definitely being more open-minded than a racist or, whatnot. But the danger with that thinking is that laws or morality, even what is right and what is wrong, become determined by a culture rather than some higher standard. And, the question you have to raise is, how do we know a culture's values are correct? How do we know that those values aren't going to change all of a sudden? Does that mean that good and bad, or good and evil, whatever, change with, as the culture changes? Like an example would be the fundamental Muslim practice limits women's rights to vote. Is it right for women to vote in America then, but it's wrong for women to vote in Saudi Arabia? Can both things be true at the same time? So it kind of poses a question, a problem of a philosophical problem. Can two things be true at the same time? Opponents of cultural relativism argue that there is a set ethical truth that exists and it is relevant to all cultures, but it's something that transcends culture. There's a book by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man. He's a philosopher, British. He wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia series. But in this book, The Abolition of Man, he's basically defending the idea that there is an absolute type of morality that all cultures sort of have some understanding of. He's not arguing for, particular laws or anything like that, but he's just saying, we don't just make this up as we go. In some way, a higher standard actually does exist. He calls that the Tao in this book, and this is how he defines it: the belief that certain attitudes are really true and that others are really false. Like, it's okay to say there's right and wrong. And he calls it the Tao because it's just a term to show that these morals exist in many cultures. He uses examples from Chinese literature, the Bible, Plato, Hinduism, and other cultures too. He doesn't define the source of the Tao, and I think that's up for debate. Christians would say the Bible defines what is true. Marxists would say it all boils down to money and the economy. Freud would talk about sex as being, the source of all truth about human nature. But, even just to take it to the level of saying there is a universal truth, we may not know or disagree with where that exactly comes from, but we do agree that there is something there. That is definitely in contrast to cultural relativism. And then in his book, C.S. Lewis talks about some of the universals that typically you find across the boards in cultures. The views on gender roles, taboo about incest, traditional roles in marriage practices, that it's good and right to protect your children, to be loyal to your country, to find justice in a court system, to be discouraged of stealing and committing adultery. I mean, what culture would you go to where they'd say, oh, it's okay to sleep with your husband's or your best friend's wife, or vice versa? Of course that goes on all the time, but is it culturally acceptable? I mean, I think you would universally find that that's just not an acceptable practice. Okay, the second bullet on this slide, I just wanted to distinguish types of culture. First of all, we have mainstream culture, which is what expresses the norm, or what, the overall attitudes of a culture. And then we also have, and sometimes more interestingly, counterculture, or subculture is another way of saying it. It expresses the views of a minority, and that view is often less respected or misunderstood. It's less known, but those types of countercultures and subcultures can be equally as interesting. So I just came up with a couple examples here. Mainstream cultural practices in America currently are things like abortion, that's acceptable. Gay marriage, I mean, that's somewhat up for debate still, but I believe it has taxation, democracy, like the voting process. Those are all just accepted cultural practices. Countercultural practices, there's a lot you could list. I put tattoos, but it actually has become, I would say, mainstream nowadays to get a tattoo. It's not just for rebels and sailors and everything. Neo-Nazi organization, an organization that supports the idea of the Nazis, and ethnically cleansing people. Flag burning, the Ku Klux Klan. There's a lot of countercultural practices that either are in opposition to the mainstream culture, or just at least kind of operate separate from that mainstream culture. So in general, it's helpful when you're studying a culture to consider whether the views and practices of that culture are mainstream or countercultural or subcultural. Depending on the topic that you pick, that is going to affect. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to my face here. Oh, I don't know if I can get back to my face. You'll just have to listen to me. But anyways, oh, here I am. Hi. Okay. Determining whether your culture is mainstream or countercultural helps you know where to place that culture and understand where it fits in the context of other cultures. So that's all I have for now. Hopefully this helped you a little bit, and work on that forum where you define culture and also think about which culture you belong to, and we'll go from there.